My name is Andre Cohen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And at Revo Health, we have, and it's so funny because oftentimes when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, folks ask like, what is the business case for doing that? And so at Revo Health, we've really focused on helping physicians do what they do best. Right. So when it comes to recruiting, when it comes to helping physicians maintain a workforce that's effective, my office, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, really works with physician practices to make sure that we do that. And so I'm really excited to kind of engage in some of the conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion with you in this space. And so let's get to it, right? And so one of the things that we've been talking about lately in the office is this question, right? So why is it difficult? Why is it difficult to talk about diversity issues? And, you know, as we've been engaging with our clients, as we've been engaging with community members, as we've been engaging with other professional organizations, one of the things that we found are that there are typically kind of four answers that keep kind of coming up for that, right? And one is that I've been sheltered. You know, I don't know what to say or what to do. And I don't know how to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. And oftentimes it's just too political. It is absolutely too political. And it's a lot easier just not to talk about it, right? It's a lot easier not to talk about it. And so one of the things that I want to remind folks is, let's just kind of go down the list, right? So I've been sheltered. So what is the purpose of a shelter? The purpose of a shelter is to protect you. And so although we may have grown up in environments that we perceive now to be sheltered environments, I would submit to you that those environments were designed to protect you from the elements. And so our parents can only give us what they had, and our grandparents can only give us what they had. And what we must recognize is that what we were given was given to help protect us, to guide us, to shape us, to mold us. And when we find that those things are no longer helpful, that's when we must change, right? So it's not helpful to blame the past or feel bad about what you did or did not receive from those caregivers, but to just recognize that it's important that we define from here forward how we want to use those things, right? And, I don't know how to have diversity conversations. Great. That's a great place to start because those are the kinds of people I can work with. I can't work with the people who know it all. I can't work with the people who don't want to change, who already know what the conversation is going to be, so I don't even want to talk about it. I don't even want to address it. Those folks who say, you know what, I don't know how to do that, and I'm interested in doing it. I'm interested in being a part of critical conversations that help me become more effective. Those are the folks we can work with. Those are the folks that could use our services as diversity practitioners, right? And so whether you're in a nonprofit organization, a for-profit organization, a quasi-governmental organization. These are the kinds of folks who say, I don't know how to do that. Those are the folks we can work with. We can teach, we can train, we can develop, we can grow, right? And when people say that it's too political, I agree. I don't disagree that it's way too political, but it shouldn't be, right? Treating people with equity, with dignity, with opportunities to compete on an even playing field is totally in keeping with the intentions of the Constitution of the United States. So those things are way too political, but they shouldn't be too political, right? And two things can be true at the same time. We had just a conversation the other day about Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. Two sides of the same coin, and they can exist at the same time. So it doesn't have to be too political. And lastly, some people say it's just easier not to talk about it. And I'm curious. I'm curious about that, right? So is it easier to not push the button on the elevator to get to your floor? is it easier to ignore the fire raging in your kitchen as opposed to paying attention to it, right? And so what I would suggest is that sometimes, and it's funny if you think about like convenience stores as opposed to going to grocery stores. So I grew up in a community where it was easier to go to the corner store than it was to go to the grocery store. And at those corner stores, you could buy very similar things to what you could at the grocery store, but you paid a convenience fee. And so even though it may be easier not to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, what does it cost not to? What convenience fee are you paying to not talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so my conclusion is that it's not so much that we should not or should talk about it, but it's how we talk about it. How do we talk about those things that help us to become more effective versus those things that fuel ineffectiveness, right? How do we become more effective? And so one of the things that I like to talk about is this idea that there's a development model that we should be encouraging, right? There is this opportunity for us to kind of move from the couch to 5K. I don't know if anyone has ever thought about running a marathon or attempted to run a marathon, but you don't wake up on a Monday and say, I'm going to run a marathon on a Wednesday. Right, that just doesn't happen, right? Particularly if you've never done it before, and so you have to recognize that there's an opportunity to move from the couch to the 5K and then on to the marathon. And so very much so that these diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging conversations are much like that marathon. And so that there are skills that one can develop. There are things that one can learn or grow, or capacities that can be built. However, the caveat to all of that is this question: where do I want to be? Right? And so when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, it harkens back to me or reminds me of when I taught K-12 and when I was a student in public schools in the K-12 system. And one of the things that people would oftentimes say to me as a young person, I'm sure many of us who've grown up in the West may have heard this as well, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? The interesting thing is I am now grown up and I cannot answer that question. Right? And I can't answer that question because many of the things, the jobs that I've held, the positions that I hold, did not exist when I was a child. So I could have never imagined being what I am today. However, I think a question that actually leads us to better answers, to better guidance in terms of our development is, what kind of person do you want to be when you grow up? Right? And so when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, it isn't, what kind of DEI leader I want to be. It's what kind of employee do I want to be that recognizes the value of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. What kind of employee do I want to be? When I've talked with employers across the nation, what I have found is that employers say there are certain things I can't teach my employees. I can teach my employees to do the skill, to do the craft, to create the product, to produce the widget. But what I can't teach them is how to respect folks. What I can't teach them is how to be motivated. What I can't teach them is how they can apply what we've learned in our work settings. So those are things that I can't necessarily teach folks, these intrinsic values that I can't teach folks. And I think that's where diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging comes in and says, you know what, these are skills that we can develop and they're transferable skills, right? And so when do we need to change, right? Again, I was sheltered. I was limited in my knowledge and we need to change when we recognize that what we currently have won't lead us to where we want to go, right? What we currently have can't lead us to where we want to go. And so when we think about that, I really love using this example of the Brazil nuts, right? And so my family, I grew up calling these things Brazil nuts. But I have been made aware that there are other families that called them other things, right? that have called them they've called them the N-word toes, right? And I think it's interesting that when people come into the knowledge of that, they have some choices. They have choices to make, right? Do I continue to use the N-word toes, or do I switch to calling them Brazil nuts? Now, this is really important information because oftentimes people will say, well, you just want me to be politically correct. As a matter of fact, I don't want you to be politically correct. I'm not trying to make mini-me's. I'm not trying to make mini-me's, right? Because one Andre is enough. Let me just tell you, right? But here are we talking about political correctness, or are we talking about mutual respect? Which of those two things, political correctness or mutual respect, allows us to become more effective, right? I would suggest that I've seen a world where there is no political correctness, and I don't like that world. So I'm not suggesting that. But what I am asking is, oftentimes we don't dig deep enough into the rationale of why we want folks to speak in a civil way to one another, right? And so I was engaged in this process, and someone was like, well, how come I can say, how come other people can say a word that I can't, and I think that's unfair and whatnot, and I just kind of laughed and said, there are a couple of things. First, we have to recognize that we have to understand why we want to do things, and then how those things align with our values, how those things help us to accomplish goals, how those things allow us to be more effective, right? And so a lot of times people will say, deliver jokes in the workplace, or they'll make a comment, and then they'll back up and say, well, I didn't mean to say that. And I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that. But what I would suggest is to ask the follow-up question, so what did you mean? If you didn't mean that, what did you mean, right? And so that allows us to start developing this mutual respect. So not only can we hear what's in people's hearts, even though it's not coming out their mouths, but at some point those two things will be aligned, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But that we encourage people to be thoughtful in how they engage, right? And so, no, it's not about simply political correctness, but it's actually about mutual respect. And so, it's funny. Older people use my name, and they say, Andre, right? And I tolerate that because there's, potatoes, tomatoes, right? Kind of thing. However, when I correct them, or if I correct them, and they continue to mispronounce my name, then that could start causing a harm in our relationship, what would lead us to be less effective in our interactions, right? And so mutual respect will say, well, if I want to be called Andre or Andres, even with your limited stuff, at some point, if you respect me, or you will start to call me by what I want to be called, right? So we'll talk more about that in another session. One thing I think is important is to recognize that we are all after very similar things. We're after safety, significance, and belonging. Right. And so one of the things that's important in this space is to recognize that that safety is this physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, psychological space where I can develop to my fullest potential. Right. I feel safe in doing those things and developing to my fullest potential. We also recognize that significance is either something that the universe has presented you with and said, oh, here you go, thou shalt now, right? Or it's something that I've decided that this is my purpose in life. This is what I want to go after. This is the kind of person that I want to be, right? So I either, get that significance from the universe, or I decide what that significance is. And belonging is is recognizing that I can be in relationships with people, I can be in organizations, I can participate in groups that understand my significance and allow me to get my safety, right? And so when we talk about the safety, significance, and belonging, those oftentimes are very similar things that human beings are after. Simultaneously, how we define safety, how we define significance, how we define belonging could be very different from culture to culture, from faith tradition to faith tradition, from almost family to human, right? How the methods we use to acquire safety, the methods we use to acquire significance, the methods we use to acquire belonging could also be different in each of those aspects as well. And so when we think about what people are after, we're after very similar things, but our meanings and our methods may be very different. And it is upon those things that we can have conversations and we can talk about those things, right? We can talk about those methods. We can talk about those meanings. But I have to understand that people are after very similar things. And so when I'm engaging with someone, I have to ask myself, what is it? What of these three things are in play in my interaction? And so how do I understand the other person? Are they looking for significance in this? Are they looking for belonging in this? Are they looking for safety in this? And then I have to ask myself, what am I looking for in this interaction? Am I looking for belonging? Am I looking for significance? Am I looking for safety as we interact, right? And so we're after very similar goals, but how we get there is very different. And so when we think about our relationship, oftentimes we recognize that just like that couch to 5K, that my intentions may be very different than my behaviors. And when I'm willing to be conscious of that, when I'm minding the gap, paying attention to that development gap, I also recognize that development gap is also an opportunity gap, right? It's an opportunity for me to fill, or may have been things that I've missed, but now I can fill that development gap by creating more opportunities to learn, to change, to grow. And so in what ways can I start to fill that opportunity gap? Or that development gap? I become more cognitive in my control, right? So cognitive control. And so when we think about this notion of cognitive control, and we think about this concept of effectiveness, what we really want to make sure is that what we're filling this development gap or this opportunity gap with is with our goals and our values. So when I am being effective, I have aligned my intentions, my values, my goals to my behaviors. And so that allows me to be cognitively in control. And so when I tell a joke, the question that I must ask myself, even before that joke comes out of my mouth, is what are my intentions in telling this joke? How does that joke align with my values? What does that look like for my behaviors? And what are the goals of that joke? And that allows me to become cognitively in control, which allows me to be more effective in what I do, right? And so is it right or wrong? I don't know. Is it effective or is it not? Are you in cognitive control, or is your amygdala being pressed to act and behave without this cognitive control? You right? So are you mindful or mindless? Right? And so when we think about what it means to be effective in the DEI spaces, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space, it becomes important that we develop and use this muscle of cognitive control. And so as we do that, what we recognize is that we become more effective, and so we spend less time talking about, the morality of a thing, which is a conversation that needs to be had. But what I'm really intrigued by is how do we help people and organizations become more effective in this DEI space so that we eliminate unconscious bias, that microaggressions aren't even something that we have to deal with, that discretionary effort just goes through the roof, right? And so as we look at our employee surveys and engagement surveys and talk about our affinity groups and whatnot, that we start to see that these things become this effectiveness becomes integral in this DEIB space. And so My name is Andre Cohen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. We hope to have more of these conversations moving forward. And, if you have any questions, you can contact me at Revo Health, where we help physicians do what they do best. This is Andre. Have a great day. Goodbye.